Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Sorry, sorry about that.
Right.
I'll give you.
With the advancement in new technology, the landscape for power systems is changing very rapidly. Information technology has really made a huge difference in enabling some of the things that we work on. I've been able to leverage IEEE USA to be in the leading edge of my industry. IEEE is all about a sense of community. I am learning ideas and concepts and thinking completely out of the box. IEEE USA is my competitive edge.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to today's IEEE USA live stream webinar, Critical Thinking for Engineers. I'm your host, Jonathan Cho. Our presenter for today's webinar is co-founder of Viventi Group, Sridhar Ramanathan. Sridhar has 30 years of experience in technology companies, from startups to blue-chip firms, and previously served as marketing executive for Hewlett-Packard's Managed Services, where he was responsible for marketing worldwide and managing the portfolio of HP Managed Services $1.1 billion unit. Sridhar is also the author of IEEE USA's Critical Thinking Skills for Engineers eBook series. IEEE USA's goal is to create programming that is valuable, relevant, and of interest to you. We will be sending a short survey to all registrants after this event and would love your feedback. We value your opinions and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes and share your thoughts. Without further ado, I will now pass it off to our presenter for today, Sridhar. Welcome.
Great to see you, Jonathan. Thank you, and thank you all for joining the IEEE USA webinar here today. So yeah, let's just jump on in. Thank you so much. You know, I deal with a lot of technology companies, many engineers and marketing people and salespeople. You know, the thing about critical thinking is it really applies to everybody, not just engineers. So what I'll be doing today is walking through some tips, some 8 specific tips that hopefully will make us all better critical thinkers. You can go to the next slide there, Jonathan. Let's start off with what is critical thinking. So this is a definition I really like. Critical thinking is a self-guided, self-disciplined thinking which attempts to reason at the highest level of quality in a fair-minded way. A couple things I want to call out in this definition of critical thinking. One is it's about ourselves. We are the ones who are doing the critical thinking. It's self-guided, it's self-disciplined, it's a way to think. Other thing I want to call out is quality. Critical thinking is not about making snap judgments, quick decision-making, although that's sometimes very much valued. Critical thinking is all about the quality of thinking in a very fair-minded way, fair-minded meaning objective. So we can go to the next slide. Let's talk about, thanks, Jonathan, somebody who's really good at critical thinking, a bit of an iconoclast. We all know Steve Jobs. And one of the keys to critical thinking, of course, is just asking why, always questioning what we do. And in the 8 tips I'm going to share with you today, you'll see that's a very common theme, asking why. We'll go to the next slide there, please. Now, we're going to cover 8 specific topics that are part of critical thinking. And here are the 8 before you. I'm going to go through each and every one of these. I'm going to give you an example or 2 of each of them. And by the way, there's some audience participation. So please, I'm looking at the chat box right now. I'm looking for any comments down the line. I am going to answer questions at the end, but there's a couple sections in here where I'm going to ask you to enter comments in the chat field down there. So let's go ahead and get started with the first of elements of critical thinking. Number 1 is problem statements. We can go to the next slide there, please. Now, when you think about problem statements, this is a very famous quote. When you think about, before you jump into solving a problem, first think about the problem. What is the problem? Now, there's a famous person who said this. Jonathan, click one more time. Albert Einstein said this: if I had an hour to work on a problem, I'm going to take 55 minutes to frame the problem, really think about the problem before I can jump to solution mode. This is very counterintuitive. As engineers, a lot of us, or as innovators, want to jump to the answer, jump to a solution. Well, sometimes it's really worth dwelling on the problem statement itself. So let's go into a little more detail on that. Next slide there, please. This is a real skill, and I'm going to walk you through some of the elements. We can advance the full slide here. When you frame a problem statement, by the way, it's not always a problem statement. Sometimes it's an opportunity, not a problem, but something new, exciting, innovative, out of the box, right? It's not necessarily a problem, but it's something, an opportunity, maybe something aspirational. It's still really helpful to go through these 5 points here. So first you want to lay out the context. What is the context in which we are looking at problems? 2 is, what's the current situation? How are things being done today? 3 is, what is the impact of today's situation? Is it maybe suboptimal, not ideal, painful? 4th is, now what would the world look like in this ideal state? Now let's talk about what is possible. And in the problem statement itself, we want to give a little hint, a little clue on some possible solutions. So I'm going to give you a real example here of what this might look like. We can go to the next slide there, please. And then what's interesting is, let's take a real example of a problem statement or an opportunity that's being framed. So many of you may have heard of the XPRIZE. The XPRIZE is a $20 million prize that's been announced. It's actually been released this year. And the problem statement was around, how do we reduce or take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, okay, because it's causing all kinds of problems, and turn them into everyday usable household products. So it was a competition. This was a competition. The winner gets $20 million. Actually, there are a few winners. And let's break this thing down into this competition. What was the problem statement? Let's go to the next slide, please. And good afternoon, everyone. As you're joining today's webinar on critical thinking, really glad to have you here today. So we're talking about critical thinking and 8 specific steps. Now I'm on the step on problem statements, and I'm going to go through 5 steps. In the XPRIZE example, let's talk about the context. The context for this XPRIZE is, hey, CO2 in the atmosphere is a real problem. It's been rising for decades. By the way, I'm not talking about whether this is human created or not. That's a whole different topic, but we factually know, going back the last 800,000 years, CO2 in the atmosphere has just been going up. Current situation is there's 420 parts per million, and it continues to rise in the middle of 2021, and that's causing all kinds of problems. The third is the impact. What's the impact of this problem statement? Well, as you can see here, there's a lot of issues going on: heat waves, fires, hurricanes, snowstorms, droughts, more, and it's affecting humans and animals and plants. So clearly there is an impact around having the CO2 level go up. So these are the first 3 steps of the problem statement. The next slide, Jonathan, please. Now let's frame, well, what would the world look like if this problem was resolved? So you want to paint a brief picture, and the ideal state here is, what if the CO2 levels in the atmosphere were back to the 1950s level, 310 parts per million? That's a considerable reduction. Then a lot of these extreme conditions of heat waves and hurricanes and things of that nature would be greatly reduced and much more manageable. So now let's point to the solution. Remember, this is the XPRIZE. They're offering $20 million for practical engineering solutions to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it into useful products in the home, in the household, in industrial materials, consumer goods, etc. So it doesn't tell you the answer, but it says, we're looking for something like this, okay? Those are the 5 steps. Now we can go, Jonathan, to the next one. Who won the prize? So here's the winner. This is a company, it's called Carbon Cure, and very innovative solution. What they have done is they're able to capture carbon in the atmosphere and then use that to produce concrete. Concrete production, by the way, is one of the most highest footprint usages or creators of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's really a big emissions into the atmosphere. And what this company did, Carbon Cure, is they're able to take carbon out of the atmosphere and then use it in the production of concrete in a way that really reduces the amount of water and also reduces the carbon footprint. So this is putting that CO2 in the atmosphere into a much better usage. So they were one of the winners. There were several others, but this is the one I thought you might all find really interesting. By the way, there's some household products like toothpaste, believe it or not, and shampoos. Some companies have figured out how to grab carbon from the atmosphere and get that plowed into consumer products. So we can go to the next slide, please. What we've just covered here is the importance of framing a problem, and that's what the XPRIZE $20 million contest did. They framed a problem, and then they got people to, whoops, we lost the slide, got people to really delve into the problem. So what you want to do, this is my tip number 1 here, is a well-crafted problem statement has these 5 elements. Number 1, it sets context. Number 2, it provides what's the current situation. Number 3, what's the impact of the current situation? Why is that a problem? And number 4 is the ideal state. And then number 5 is some hints around the next solution. So this is all number 1. Now let's move to tip number 2 for skill number 2, please, Jonathan. Now let's ask thoughtful questions. Critical thinking, as you saw in the Steve Jobs quote, is really asking why. What's going on here? Why is this happening? And I'm going to give you a real example. I know I get frustrated when my phone runs out of juice by the middle of the afternoon. Sometimes it's just really frustrating. It's a problem. So let's practice this number 2 skill of critical thinking. How might we think about your phone running out of battery in the middle of the day or end of the day? So we can go to the next slide. Here's a set of questions. These are thoughtful questions. Okay, now what kind of questions? Now let's suppose I'm an engineer. I'm an engineer at Apple, or maybe I work at Samsung, or maybe I work at any of these manufacturers. How should I think about this problem about running out of phone battery charge late in the day, or just on my way back from the office or commuting? My phone's running out of juice when I don't have an outlet to charge it. What do I do? So we can go to the next slide. And these are just examples of what an engineering manager might ask her team, right? She might be asking her team, hey, before we go figure out, let's go put a big fat battery in this phone. That's one solution. Let's really step back for a moment and say, all right, what's really going on here? So here's some questions an engineering manager might ask to look at the problem of, hey, this battery seems to be running out too soon. So one is, well, what can we do to increase the recharge time? Let's suppose it takes 8 hours and you run out of juice. Well, how do we make that running out of juice happen after 12 hours, 15 hours, 18 hours? What can we do to stretch out that recharge time? 2 is, well, what's consuming all this power? Which applications are guilty? I know on my phone, my email app is a hog. That thing just uses a ton of power. What other system processes, are consuming power? So we're asking some why questions here. We're also asking how questions. How could we optimize these mobile apps to save energy, right? Not be such a hog. How might we encourage users, right? How do we encourage users to change their settings that might save power? How can we improve the efficiency of the battery itself? The battery is getting better and better every year, so there's efficiency in the battery itself. What else is affecting the ability for the battery to retain a charge? The supplier, Apple obviously has a supplier, and Samsung and all the manufacturers, they don't all build their own batteries. So what could the supplier do to squeeze out some more power? And then lastly, this is really out of the box. Is there a way that the phone itself could generate power? I've heard some people have a little, kind of a container or a package around this thing with a solar panel battery on the back, and that can actually generate some power. So what you can see here is these are a bunch of why and how questions. I didn't get into, let's go fix the battery by putting in a bigger battery. That's sort of jumping to a solution. I'm asking some very broad questions. So if I'm an engineering manager, these are the things I would pose to my team. Like, hey, what are all these different things we should be thinking about before we jump to a solution? Jonathan, we can go to the next slide, please. So my challenge to you is the skill number 2 around asking thoughtful questions. See if you can generate 10 questions, most of which should be why and how questions, not so much what questions. If you need a what, that's fine, but whys and hows tend to, point you to some really innovative out-of-the-box thinking. All right, so that's number 2. Let's move to number 3. Okay, now let's talk about causation versus correlation. This is a really interesting kind of a pitfall many people fall in, and this happens in a lot of popular news articles and publications where people will say X is causing Y. Let me give you a real example. So in this case, we might be looking, the y-axis is the value. So you have 2 plots here, blood sugar. That means blood sugar is going up over time and then coming back down. And then there's blood pressure, which is also, the blood pressure is going up and coming down. And you can see that blood sugar is preceding blood pressure just by a tiny bit. You see that? You can see that the curve is just ahead of, maybe it's like a minute or 2 ahead of blood pressure. So I could be looking at this, let's suppose I'm a doctor and I see this plot here, you might fall into the trap of saying, well, it looks like increased blood sugar is causing an increase in blood pressure. Is that true? Is blood sugar increase causing blood pressure increase? Or maybe both of them is being caused by something else, right? So how do we know what's causing what? How do we know that they're not correlated versus causative? So let's go to the next slide. If the doctor asks some tricky questions, you'll find out, well, wait a minute, what were you doing before your blood sugar and blood pressure went up? Oh, okay. You've been drinking a Monster or some kind of power drink. And power drinks, we know, have a lot of caffeine, have a lot of sugar. So what is actually causing blood pressure, blood sugar to go up is not sugar going up and pressure causing pressure, but this power drink is the culprit here. It caused when the person drank the power drink, momentarily, a little bit later, the sugar starts spiking simultaneously, sugar goes up, pressure goes up. Now, what's going on there? How do we still know whether those are causative or correlated? Next slide there, please, Jonathan. Now, this causation correlation thing you will find completely in the field of economics. Thank you. I see a comment in the chat field. A lot of times in politics, in economics, there's a ton of people making assertions of A causes B, and a lot of times it's just not true. In this example I'm giving you, right, with a medical example, what's happening is the drink, and for my apologies to Monster, I don't mean to call out the Monster brand. There are plenty of brands out there. There are power drinks. I'm just using it as one example. The drink is causing blood pressure to rise because of caffeine. Caffeine causes our heart to pump faster, beat faster, and beating faster, and is causing pressure to rise. In addition, this drink has a lot of sugar, right? A ton of sugar in it. Sugar causes blood sugar, glucose, to rise. The two are correlated. Blood pressure and blood sugar are correlated. One is not causing the other. So it's very easy to fall into the trap of, oh, A is causing B, when you have to look back a little further, look back in time, or look at other causative or contributing factors. Okay, let's take a next example. So the tip here, let me summarize with the tip. Next slide there, Jonathan, please. So be careful when you read the newspaper, when you read magazines, when you see stuff on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you're going to see all kinds of claims. Oh, this is causing that. Well, double click on that and say, well, how do you know A is causing B? Maybe they're just related. Maybe there's some other factor, like we saw in the drink, the power drink. The power drink was the culprit causing these two conditions. So be really careful. You're a critical thinker, and you just want to ask, hey, how do you know that? Why do you know that? Why do you believe these are correlated? Why do you think one causes another? So that's an important tip, to be a critical thinker, okay, before you arrive at a judgment. Now, let's take a look at number 4, please, Jonathan. And we're about halfway through, making good use of time. And now another thing is data. A lot of times as we interpret data, we can fall into some traps, and sometimes we will miss some really important insights that are hidden in the data. And I want to give you an example of a person named Cecilia Payne. Cecilia Payne is an astronomer. She was one of the first graduates from Harvard with a PhD. And she said, very interesting quote, "We must not forget that some of the best ideas seem like nonsense." And let me give you an example. Next slide, please. Now, Cecilia Payne was the first Harvard graduate with a PhD in astronomer, and she did something absolutely breakthrough at the time. When you look at the sun at that point in time, 1925, today it seems super obvious to us, but believe it or not, back in 1925, early 1900s, people believed that the sun and the earth were the same. They were made of the same elements: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, nickel, so forth. And that is true. The sun and the earth, if you look at the spectral output of the sun, if you look at the spectral lines, the emission lines, very similar to Earth. The problem is, and Cecilia Payne figured this out, there's way more hydrogen than helium. There's tons more, several orders of magnitude, more hydrogen and helium, and that's what's burning. And it's not the same with the sun. Now, at the time her dissertation came out, she asserted that the sun is not the same as the Earth. It has a lot more hydrogen, helium, this is burning, and through a process. Her advisor, a lot of people dismissed it. They said, well, we don't believe in that. But what she did about the data, remember, she's interpreting data. She had the same data as everybody else. But what she did is she looked not just at the spectral lines, but she looked at what is the volume of emissions at those different lines, right? There's a lot more hydrogen and helium. So in the data was hidden a secret, the secret that she revealed. It took 5 years for her to get credit, by the way. Her initial advisor took credit, and then ultimately they reversed. And now I really like to promote Cecilia Payne as an amazing astronomer, female astronomer, at a time when women were not particularly welcome in that field. So what she did, and I'm pointing out here in number 4, is check again on your data. You might have some amazing insights, and don't be too quick to dismiss something that you find there. So next slide, please, Jonathan. So here's the tip, that what we learned from Cecilia Payne is there could be some startling insight in the data that you get. So you're an engineer, let's say you're a scientist or a marketing person or a salesperson, you're looking at sales data, be careful. There's some interesting insights that may be hidden there. If you want to take a second look and see, are there interesting patterns? There's a whole field called big data. And there's a lot of AI and machine learning going on to find out the cool insights that are hidden in data. So when you're a critical thinker, you want to question the data, you want to examine that data, you want to really find out, are there hidden patterns in the data before you leap to some conclusion. So that's number 4. Let's go to number 5, please. All right, skepticism. Critical thinkers are skeptical by nature. They don't instantly believe everything they read in the newspaper, from not just the news source, but from all kinds of information that you read every single day, whether it's videos, whether it's podcasts, whether it's something you're reading. Here's a real example of being skeptical. So back in World War II, the United States military was gathering a lot of data about airplanes, military aircraft that were shot down. And what you are seeing here is an image. It's a compilation of where were all the bullet holes. When these planes crashed, these are military aircraft. When they crashed on the ground, the engineers, they looked at all the bullet holes. All the red dots you see this is over, I think, several hundred data points. They found this is the pattern of bullet holes. And the question the military engineers asked was, well, where should we add additional metal armor to prevent these planes from crashing, right? How do we make them stay up in the air? How do we keep them up in the air longer, okay? So the data is saying, well, maybe we should add metal where all those bullet holes are, right? Because it seems like a pretty logical conclusion. If you add metal, more metal, kind of shore up the armor on the wings, in the middle of the airplane, on the tail, maybe that will keep the airplanes up and lasting. And that's what the military engineers did. They added more metal. They added more metal to the airplanes. Next slide, please. What they found, however, Jonathan, is they were wrong. Whoops, sorry, back one. What they found actually is there was a mathematician, his name is Abraham Wald, I believe he's Hungarian. He said, guys, you have it all wrong. You don't want to put metal where all the bullet holes are, because those are the planes, the planes that didn't make it, the ones that blew up in the sky, they never came to the ground, are the ones that were shot where there are not bullet holes. Because the ones that had bullet holes, remember, are the ones on the ground, the ones that crash and you could actually see the holes. Well, the ones that blew up in the sky are the ones that had a fatal shot. And if you look at the spaces, it's where were these bullet holes? Well, it shot the fuselage, it shot the engines, where the pilot is in the fuselage area before the tail. Those are the most vulnerable spots, not where the bullet holes are on the planes that are on the ground. It's the ones that blew up in the sky that we never saw. That's missing data. Remember, that's missing. They didn't have data on the planes that obviously blew up in the sky. So this mathematician was really smart. He figured out, look, man, we're looking at this totally wrong. We should be looking at where are the planes getting shot that never hit the ground. And what they did, the military engineers did, they shored up the metal around these spots. Sure enough, people weren't dying as quickly. The planes stayed up in the air longer and pilots were able to survive, carry their missions, good or bad. So that's an example of healthy skepticism. This mathematician, Abraham Wald, called out that they're looking at the wrong data set. So let's go to the next point there, please, Jonathan. So be careful, be careful. When you're healthy, when you have healthy skepticism, you don't want to follow the lemmings off the cliff. Look at this. When you're off the cliff and saying, I'm having second thoughts, that's a little too late. So back to the Steve Jobs quote, you really want to be questioning everything and, really hold off on judgment, hold off on conclusions. What am I missing here? Is there some interesting data? Is there a different way I should be looking at this before I leap to a conclusion? So you can see again my theme around asking why. Abraham Wald, who did this, asked why. Like, why do we think that adding metal where the bullet holes are on planes on the ground is the best answer? So let's go to the next one here, please. And yes, you can put questions into the chat field. I'm going to get them as many as I can towards the end here. Now let's look at one other female engineer. And you can see there's a theme here. I'm really trying to encourage a lot more women in engineering. We need more, of course, men and women. So similarities and differences. Another thing about critical thinking is sometimes people get into the habit of saying, oh, this is just like XYZ, or boy, this is totally different from ABC. We get into a little bit of yes, right, yes, no, left, right, right, wrong, black, white. People are very polar. That's not always helpful because we can make some mistakes. So here is a chemical engineer. Her name is Stephanie Kwolek. She used to work at DuPont. This is some years ago. She was an engineer who they were going through a lot of different compositions of polymers. There are many formulations of polymers. As you know, DuPont is a chemical engineering company. And she found something that was a mistake. When she's mixing up these different polymers, she found one polymer, guess what, that wouldn't stick to anything. Does that sound familiar? A polymer that doesn't stick to anything or doesn't let things stick to it. Let's go to the next slide, please. And what she found out is this polymer, it looks just like all these other polymers, was actually was Teflon. So she was the one who found out about Teflon. So all these polymers, in a way, are kind of like a paperclip. Polymers have many, many, many uses, but she stumbled on a particularly different usage. Remember, this is a polymer like all the other polymers, but there's something different about this particular polymer, right? It's a Teflon, and it had a totally different application. So on pots and pans, we use Teflon. It's used in many applications. So what I want you to do in the chat window, this is audience participation, everybody. So in the lower right, you should see a little chat. And what I'm going to ask you to do is please come up with an idea, a novel idea for the average ordinary paper clip. You probably have one on your desk now. What can you do with a paper clip? And there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just trying to get you to brainstorm something totally different. So please think about what can you do with a paper clip. I've got one right here in my hand, okay, paper clip. What can you do with a household paper clip? And just sort of throw in ideas if you could in the chat window, please. I'll give you a minute to do that. You can make a necklace. Yep, you can open a CD drive. I hadn't thought about it. Opening a door lock. Sometimes I have 4 teenage kids. One of them might lock the door by accident, and I have to use a paper clip. A Christmas ornament. Hey, that's clever. A battery cover on my phone. I've actually done that. I've used the paper clip to open it up. A fishing hook. Yeah, a picture hanger. Emergency eject tool. Yeah, that's true for a CD drive. Open a SIM card. 100 amp fuse. Wow, I didn't realize you could use this for 100 amp. So lots of creative ideas. Thank you, guys. Keep going. I'll give you 10 more seconds on this. Hold a chapstick in place in the car drink organizer. That's very creative. A hanger, abstract artwork. Interesting. Electrical jumper. So keep going there. You can see lots of ideas. So what you have generated here, and we can go ahead and pause now. You have generated fantastic ideas, out-of-the-box ideas for a paperclip, right? So let's suppose you're an engineer in a company and someone comes with you a problem. You really want to sort of think differently, think broadly about potential uses. So thank you so much, by the way. Thank you all for your comments. That's really, you got a lot of creative people there, Jonathan. I'm very pleased with the IEEE audience here. Keep up that idea. Small spring, by the way, dress pin, lots of interesting ideas. Thank you. So we can go to the next slide, please, Jonathan. So what I'm asking you to do when you are brainstorming, remember this is number 6 in the 8 skills of critical thinking. In critical thinking, you want to just think outside of the ordinary, outside of the obvious, outside of the traditional, outside of the same old, same old. We just did in a few seconds here some extraordinary ideas for a paperclip. And this is what engineers do. They innovate, right? They think of ordinary situations and say, well, why couldn't we try something totally different? And why is this related to critical thinking? Well, because critical thinkers are looking at things in a fresh way. They're applying quality thinking, a fresh approach before solving a problem or before thinking of a new innovation. So let's go to number 7, please. And we're coming up here on the Q&A section. We've got a couple more here to go. Another skill within critical thinking is this idea of lateral thinking. In a way, we were kind of doing it with the paperclip example. That's a little bit of out-of-the-box lateral thinking, for sure. Again, I'm using another female scientist. She was the first graduate from MIT with a master's in electrical engineering. Her name is Edith Clark. And, we take this for granted. All of us, we take this for granted. Power in our house. When you think about that 120 outlet in our house, or if you're in Europe, I think it's 220, different power outlets in your house. Where does that come from? The power generation is probably not down in your neighborhood. It's probably not in your city. It's somewhere pretty far away. It turns out that a lot of power is generated hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away. And that was not the case over 100 years ago. Power had to be done very close to the house. So we'll go to the next slide. And what Edith Clark did was absolutely brilliant. She was thinking out of the box. How do we make the long distance, electricity going down these long haul lines? How do we extend it beyond the 50-mile limit? There was a limit back in the early 1900s. They couldn't figure out, how do I get power, electrical power, to go down a wire? Because usually it attenuates. After about 50 miles, it just sort of peters out. There's just a lot of impedance, a lot of resistance. By the time you get to 50 miles, there's just like nothing left. Now, that's a real problem because 50 miles is not very far. If I live here near San Francisco, a town called Livermore, 50 miles is, that's hardly out of the San Francisco area. And there's no way we can have a nuclear power plant, or we could have a engine, turbine, dam, water power solution. We have to have energy or power that's generated thousands or hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So this 50-mile limit was a real problem. It was preventing people from getting power much beyond these sources of power. What did she do? Well, she was a mathematician, a double E from MIT, as you saw. She applied what's called hyperbolic equations. She used math, by the way. At that time, they were not thinking that math could solve this problem of wave transmission down an electrical conduit. If you think about what's going on, it's a conduit. It's like a cylinder. And how do you have wave propagation down a metal cylinder? It's a very complicated electrical engineering challenge. So she applied a mathematical formula, hyperbolic equations. She came up with what's called a calculator. And you can see in the image here, this so-called calculator is actually like a diagram. And she found a way to have electrical transmission go way beyond 50 miles using this calculator. They could actually optimize the wave transmission down the line. And that was a breakthrough contribution. It's totally lateral thinking. Like, who in a million years would have thought of using hyperbolic equations to extend electrical power beyond the 50-mile limit? So kudos to her. Again, we take this for granted. Nobody's ever heard of Edith Clark, but believe me, we have her to thank for the energy coming to our house every single day. So what can we learn from this? Next tip there, please, Jonathan. Lateral thinking means if you look at solve an engineering problem, you can look at completely different disciplines. Like what she did is she went outside of wave propagation, electrical engineering, everything she learned at MIT. She went and looked in the field of mathematics, advanced math, looked at a different methodology to solve this problem of how do I extend electrical transmission. So it truly is out of the box. Now, how do you do out of box thinking? Well, all of you guys have just done it. You just did it with this paperclip example, right? All of you, incredibly creative ideas. Jonathan, we got to write these down. These are brilliant ideas. Those are out of the box ideas. Now, one way you can get lateral thinking going is by asking why. Like, well, why is power limited to 50 miles? Like, what's causing that? The other one's random associations. In her mind, she had thought about or was reminded about hyperbolic equations for some reason. I don't know why, but she associated that with math. Also, contrarian thinking, saying, well, why is it that power stops at 50 miles? Is there any reason we couldn't make that 500 miles or 5,000 miles? So being a contrarian to question today's status quo is another way to get at lateral thinking. Okay, so let's go to number 8, please. This is their 8th skill for critical thinking. This is oh my gosh, in politics today, you'll see a lot of confirmation bias. You'll see it with regards to the pandemic, with regards to COVID, with regards to vaccinations. There's just a lot of things that people will believe, will read based on what they already know, what they already believe. So I'm going to give you a really specific non-political example here. So I run a high-tech marketing agency in San Francisco, co-founder, and manage that. And this is a simple example. We have some numbers here. The top row, this is 5 years worth of data, and I made this example up. Here's revenue. It's going from $5 million going up to $26.9 million over the course of 5 years. Now, this revenue is increasing 40% year over year, right? 5 million going to 26.4. That means every year this revenue, if you're a software company growing 40% a year, you're a startup growing 5 million, 26 million, that's pretty good. Notice that the advertising spending is also going 40% year over year. Initially, they spend $100. Let's say it's actually $100,000. And over the years, they're spending 40% more every year. Now, confirmation bias, I might be the VP of marketing and go, hey guys, I'm really thrilled that I was able to drive revenue because I've been doing a lot of advertising, and because of my advertising spend, we're driving revenue. Remember, what am I talking about here? It's that causation versus correlation. There's a fallacy here. All we know is that there's something correlation. There's a correlation here. We know that revenue is correlated with ad spend, but how do I know the ad spend is actually causing? And I may have confirmation bias, meaning I as the marketing VP might love to have everyone be proud of me because I help revenue. That's my confirmation bias. I want to believe that. Well, what if that's not true? The next slide, please, Jonathan. What if the reality is, you know what, the ad spend, yes, it's true. The ad spending went from, $100,000 to 538. Revenue went up 40%. But you know what? The leads are prospective opportunities, prospective customers. They haven't bought yet. But let's suppose leads only increased, 5%. The ad spending, what does ad spending do? Well, it increases the number of leads, the number of potential buyers, and because not all of them immediately buy. A lot of them are prospects before they buy. Well, the leads coming from advertising only grew 5%. It didn't grow 40%. It grew 5%. So that tells you, wait a minute, this revenue growth of 40%, it may not be caused by advertising, because advertising really didn't crank up leads all that much. It grew only 5%. And remember, leads are the things that convert to sales. So if leads are only growing 5% a year because of advertising, it's suspicious, it's suspect that advertising is causing revenue to grow 40% a year. So confirmation bias says, hey, I'm the VP of marketing. I want to look like a awesome executive. I want to get my bonus. I really want to believe that my marketing spend, my advertising is driving the revenue. And you know what? Not really. Yeah, you helped, but it wasn't everything. Maybe it was sales reps are doing an amazing job of calling on customers, independent marketing efforts. The salespeople may be killing it. It might be the customer support organization that is handling customer questions and adding an additional sale. It might be through support efforts, sales efforts. It has nothing to do with marketing. So the confirmation bias is sometimes we're humans. We like to believe what we believe. We will find data. We will find evidence that supports what we believe. And you all see this in politics. You see this in news. You see this in healthcare. You see this in many, many fields. So my request to you is, please check in with yourself, like, am I just believing what I want to believe, or am I open to being wrong? Could I be wrong? Critical thinkers question themselves all the time. Like, is what I believe really based in data? Is the data reliable? Am I missing some data? So let's go to the next slide. So what I would ask you to do when you check yourself for confirmation is, here's confirmation bias. Here's 7 questions to ask yourself. 1, have I jumped to a premature conclusion? Have I just jumped on something because it sounds good? It's what I already believe, Lots of examples of that. I'm not going to go to politics. I'm not going to go into healthcare. I'm not going to go to climate change, but people believe what they believe. They could be wrong. They could be right. But the question is, have I jumped to a premature conclusion? Remember the first slide I said is quality thinking, self-discipline, self-awareness. So am I premature? The data. Number 2, what data shows or is the evidence to prove the statement? Is the data reliable? Where's the data coming from? A lot of times you'll see in the internet, stuff is being thrown around as data, but it's being passed on from an unreliable source. So really look at the source of data that you're getting. Number 3 is often think of things as a hypothesis. A hypothesis says, I'm going to believe something until I have evidence to tell me something is false. So you can make a hypothesis. A hypothesis is not necessarily a fact. It's not something that's absolutely certain. It's something that's potentially true. May or may not be true, but you have to look at the data to prove it. So what's the hypothesis here? Number 4 is, are there some interesting patterns here with regards to what might be causing this thing that's going on? Are there correlations behind the scenes? Are there causes behind the scenes? So what is the pattern here? And confirmation bias says that you should look at the pattern and not just leap to a conclusion. Okay, and also question, is this causative or correlative? Number 5 is this confirmation bias based on an outlier? Is the data point that I'm seeing here, maybe I'm dismissing it too early, or maybe it's an early indicator of something going on that I should investigate further. So look for the outliers. Outliers are good. Outliers are, if you think of a bell curve, outliers tend to be the 2 sigma outs, 2 sigma on the left, 2 sigmas on the right. Those are the outliers. there's a lot of rich data in those outliers, and there's something going on you want to look at. Confirmation bias says, hey, I'm just going to stick to the middle of the road, the middle of the bell curve. That's my truth. Well, truth may be on these outliers. Okay, just like you saw Stephanie Kwolek do with the DuPont example, or Cecilia Payne, the astronomer, who looked at the sun data, solar data, and she found, on the outliers, we didn't look at the volume of helium and hydrogen atoms. We only looked at spectral output. So we have to look at these outliers. Number 6 is qualitative data. So, the paperclip example, we had a lot of interesting qualitative ideas. Quantitative data could be doing surveys, doing lots of interesting experiments, gathering hardcore data. And you want to use data to either confirm or deny a hypothesis. And so you want to corroborate or refute a conclusion. All of these 7 tips are ways for you to check within yourself. We all have confirmation bias as humans. It's a short circuit for us because, if we had to question everything that happens, here's a bottle of water for me. Should I question that it's safe to drink this? I don't have time to be questioning it. So some things we have to take as given until there's something tells us that we should question it. So confirmation bias is the 8th one. Let's go to the next one, please, Jonathan. And this is the summary. When you're checking with yourself on confirmation bias, just make sure you're interpreting data with the idea of a set of hypotheses that you want to defend, that you want to look at instead of defending some pre-existing belief. Your pre-existing belief may be true, it may be false, but it's better to look at the data to inform that. Okay, we're going to just about wrap here on the 8 tips. I'm going to summarize here, please, Jonathan, the next slide. I really encourage people to, sometimes you might look at this as overthinking something, what we're doing here today in the last 40 minutes or so, but really it's quality thinking, and the world needs more quality thinking. All of you who took your time out of your busy day to attend today's session, if there's nothing that you get from the session, it's just one thing is ask why. Ask yourself some thoughtful questions before you parrot on something in Facebook or Twitter or whatever, or engineering in the office. Before just passing along at something, ask yourself the why and how questions. Ask yourself the causation versus correlation. Is something actually causing this? Maybe this is not right. Is there some interesting data hidden in here that we should be looking at a little harder? Ask why. The number 4 point over there. Ask why. What's different about this? Is this ordinary? Is this solar data same old, or is there some hidden secret in here? Think again. Ask yourself, should we dig deeper? Should we think again? Okay, so let's, I hope I gave you lots of interesting tips. Perhaps there is an IEEE book series that I wrote. It's called the Critical Thinking for Engineers. Jonathan, we can skip a couple slides. People are asking in the chat things that we can look for. This is my contact information, by the way. Anyone would like to reach me, this is a simple way to do it. Sridhar@aventigroup.com. If you want to take a screenshot of that, you're welcome to. The next slide shows you the book series. Some people were asking, these are the IEEE USA eBooks. If you're an IEEE member, you have access to them. These are the bit.ly links. There are 5 books. Today's topic has been a lot around analytical thinking, how to be a rich critical thinking. Book 2, 3, 4, 5 cover different topics like communications, like creative thinking, like problem solving, things of that nature. So I'm going to pause here, Jonathan, maybe our last slide on the thank you. And we can open it up to questions. Jonathan, I'll ask for your help to moderate the Q&A here. We'll reserve the last 10 minutes or so.
All right, Sridhar, thank you so much for the great presentation. So folks, again, we are at the Q&A segment of the webinar. Please post your questions in the comment section and we will load them onto the stream for Sridhar to answer. We'll just give it a minute for responses. And before we get to the questions, for our audience members who are asking where to get or where to request professional development hours for attending this webinar, you can get it at IEEE USA, so IEEE USA.org/webinars. And from there, you'll find information on requesting a certificate.
Fantastic.
So Sridhar, here's our first question from our audience. One audience member asks, at what point does skepticism become unhealthy?
Well, I think it's good to not overthink. There's such a balance here. There's snap judgments, like quickly making a call, and maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. One extreme is quick judgments in a matter of seconds. The other extreme is taking too long to ponder something. Usually there's some time urgency. In your work environment, if you're an engineer, you may have a deadline coming up. You've got a product launch, you've got competition breathing down your neck, you're trying to get product to market. You don't have all day to overthink. Critical thinking is good and it's important. It's really necessary. You may want to put a time bound on it. Say, look, we're going to do some critical thinking for the next couple of days if you have certain time. So what you don't want to do is make it a reason to not do something, okay? Don't let critical thinking cause you to go off ad infinitum, doing a ton of research, doing a lot of analysis, more than is necessary. Do what you can with the time you're given with a particular product launch. I'm using that as an example. There's no concrete quantitative answer to your question. I would just say use judgment. If you're making a judgment within a second, that's probably not critical thinking. If you're taking a week to do something, that may be too long. So somewhere between a second and a week is probably the right answer. It also depends on the nature of the question you're looking into or the nature of the solution. In the pharmaceutical industry, it can take well over a year for a product to get to the market. In the semiconductor industry, it can take a couple of years. So you have some time to do some critical thinking, more time, and it's okay to quote overthink. So it really depends on your particular situation. I would just ask, whatever your normal is today, add more time than you normally do, and add more time as you see fit. Insert a little pause in there. Hope that answers your question.
Fantastic, thank you. Here's our next question. David asks, how would one address confirmation bias in politics, especially with your friends and quote unquote friends?
Confirmation bias it's pretty sinister. We as humans, we count on it. And I have politics in my family. We have very strong opinions in my family. And, usually people believe what they believe and they're not very open to change. So the thing to do is, first off, are you open? This is a question to ask, not just your friend or family member, but for yourself. Am I open to changing my mind? I literally ask myself, if someone told me something about the pandemic, about the politics, whatever, am I really open to hearing a different viewpoint? And so with your family, friends, and members, you may want to bring up, hey, are you open to a different viewpoint on this? There's a technical topic called confirmation bias, and you may want to start with yourself. David Hyman, it's a really great question. In my own family, the way I deal with conflict around this is I say I have my own confirmation bias. And people will look at me, what does that mean? Well, I have my own beliefs and I'm open to changing my beliefs. I really am. And I hope you are. And sometimes they're not. And I just check in with them. I get permission. The thing here is to ask permission. Look, are you open to hearing another viewpoint? If the answer is no, leave it alone. You don't want to be shoving something down someone's throat when they're not receptive, and calling them, hey, you have confirmation bias is not going to be very helpful. It's better to say, you know what, I see confirmation bias in myself. So start with yourself, and then that may cause the other person to be a little more open to hearing a different viewpoint. David, it's a touchy topic. We live in touchy times. I think humility goes a long way.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sure.
Our next question. How do you maintain critical thinking during a face-to-face conversation without losing focus on listening to the other person?
Well, critical thinking is listening. It's absolutely listening. Remember, we talked about looking at the data, and if you think about the thinking process, you're in a conversation with someone. First thing you want to do is listen to them. Listen, understand what they're even saying before you even get to judgments, before you get to your response, before you get to a conclusion or a counter argument. There's a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing means I'm actually waiting to talk. I'm just, I hear you talking. I'm just waiting to get my point in. That's hearing. Listening means you really are just listening to them, suspending your judgment, suspending your criticism, suspending your decision-making evaluation. That doesn't mean you're not critically thinking. It means you're just taking in the data. Now, allow some time to process and understand. Then you can pause and say, okay, here's what I'm hearing here from you. This is what I think you're saying, and here's my viewpoint or my opinion or my respond. So my suggestion is, how do you maintain critical thinking face to face? First, listen, pause, suspend your temptation to jump in and interrupt or respond. People love to be heard. People love to be understood. People love to be listened to. And the way they can tell is if your head is nodding, if you're truly processing. So there's plenty of time for critical thinking. The first step is the understanding.
Great response. Thank you.
Sure. Easier said than done, man. I know it's easier said than done. Sometimes I'm in a heated argument with someone in my own family or whoever. It's very easy to not do what I just said. So I will just empathize. It's
Right. No, absolutely. I think a lot of people, myself as well, tend to so focusing on getting our point across, but then we kind of forget to pay attention to anything else.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you. So our next question, any tips on how to read outside one's research area to get inspiration to solve one's problems?
What I would do, and this is something I like to do, is pick a domain, an area that's totally outside of your area, because sometimes creativity comes from a completely different discipline. And so, for example, during the pandemic, I learned how to play the ukulele, a totally different instrument than I've ever played before. In my spare time, one of the things I love to do, you can see over here, is astronomy. This is my telescope. What does that astronomy have to do with what I do for a living, which is I run a high-tech marketing agency? Astronomy has nothing to do with it. However, doing things like playing the ukulele, like, astronomy, telescopes, reading things that are outside of your normal reading habits are really good for us as humans. Our brain is so powerful and amazing. We're able to process and take in a lot of interesting information. And in the juxtaposition of different fields comes incredibly rich thinking, critical thinking, new ideas. I gave you several examples in today's talk of female engineers, female scientists, who all did things by bringing a totally different outside perspective to their field. So I encourage you to read things you don't normally read. Whatever you normally read, pick something totally opposite. I don't read a ton of poetry. So you know what? Maybe I should read some poetry, because who knows? That may spur some interesting thoughts. By the way, news, since it's a very political environment we live in, pick a news source that is the opposite of your traditional news source, and really listen and read what they're saying, because maybe they have a valid point. So read outside of one's research interest. You will find a lot of inspiration.
Absolutely, great response. Thank you, Sridhar. We're seeing a lot of positive feedback as well, and
thanks.
echoing your responses as well. So, also a lot of comments. Thank you to our audience for all the great comments or questions. We'll try and get to that we'll try and get to all of them as soon as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question from the audience. Oops, excuse me. Can you speak to groupthink and strategies to prevent a group-pressured posture or result?
Well, this happens a lot in group meetings, in team settings. One of the things that's really helpful to do is to call it out, is just to say, hey, I noticed that we might all be aligning on this one particular idea. Just observe. You're not making a judgment. You're not criticizing. You're saying, hey, I just noticed we as a team, use the word we, by the way, not you all. You want to be inclusive, because people can hear you. They can listen to what you're saying. If you use I and we words, if you use you words, they're going to tune out. So groupthink. Say, I noticed that we may all be aligning behind one idea, and maybe that's great. Maybe that's the best idea. Are there other ideas we should be entertaining here? For example, I have an idea, and you could speak up and say, I have something that is going against what we're all talking. Are people open to hearing it? You may even want to ask that question. Are people open to hearing something that's contrary to what we're discussing? If people go no, that means you don't have an audience that's really particularly open. Now, if you have a good leader, let's suppose you have a engineering manager and she's really good at facilitating a meeting, you may hold up your hand. So I'd like to express a complete contrarian, a different viewpoint. Are we open to that? Are we open to that? Don't say, are you open to it? Because that gets defensive, right? So group strategies, step number one, just observe what you are seeing in the team, because chances are you're not alone. If you see groupthink going on, there are other people who may see that going on. There may be other people who are thinking like you, who might be feeling afraid, who might feel you mentioned here being pressured, or is there posture or something that's going to happen? If you just make the common observation that we might be falling into all believing one thing or one idea, are we open to other ideas? So that may cause other people to say, yeah, I also was wondering, maybe there's another approach we could take. So speak out, use we words, get permission from the group to, could we entertain something? Ask a question versus making just a statement. Yelling louder doesn't really help that much. Pounding your fist on the table and, to groupthink, it's not all that effective. You can try it. I think it's better to, again, observe, call what you see, ask permission to potentially throw out a different idea, and then see if there are other people who are willing. Notice the body language, by the way. Look at the body language. As you're saying, in Zoom, it's a little more tricky, but look at the body language, because chances are, I guarantee you, there's at least one other person who's not necessarily on board with the group think.
Absolutely. I feel like it's a common thing for most people to want to feel included. So really being able to, or really using those I, we words definitely encourages more people to speak up, get more perspectives that way. And so definitely agree with that.
Absolutely.
This next question. Go ahead.
Sorry. The final thought is the group think, one way to approach another piece to that is appealing to, we may have a better quality result if we can brainstorm a little longer and come up with a couple more ideas. We may have a better outcome, a more quality, innovative, out-of-the-box idea. Could we explore that? So appeal to people's sense of innovation, that we can do better. That's all. Okay. Sorry, next question there, Jonathan.
Thank you. So this next question from Ron: how should one go about testing for causality when dealing with confirmation bias and correlation?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Testing for causality, there's actually some pretty strong statistical methods you can use, and I'm not an expert in that, but if you actually have hard data, confirmation bias can be overcome by just looking at the data itself and seeing what it's pointing to. With regards to correlation versus causality, if you have time series data can actually inform. The example I showed earlier about the power drink initially followed by these two, humps. The reason we can make the statement of causality there is that there was a time series data. So in that case, you had to go back far enough in time. If you just started the clock from the time the sugar level, glucose level goes up and the blood pressure goes up, you would fall into the trap of saying, well, sugar is causing blood pressure to go up. So one way to test for causality is to wind the clock back more. If you have time series data, is to look further back. That's one way. Another way to test for causality is to do an experiment, if you can. I don't know what field you're in, Ron Plummer, but if you're in a field where you can actually test cause and effect, that is the best. And scientists do this all day long. Engineers do this all day long. They tweak something here and see if that effect causes an effect. Maybe there's some latency, some time delay. That's a strong indicator that they're causally related. Time is one advantage. So testing, experimentation, those are some techniques. Again, if you have hard numbers, there are statistical tools you should definitely use to test for causality.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Quick answer. It's not always easy. Sometimes it takes 100 years for us to separate cause and effect. Okay, let me just give you a quick if you look at Newton versus Einstein, we thought an apple fell from the tree because of so-called gravity coming from Earth, right? The way the apple falls to the Earth is the same thing that holds the moon in orbit. It's gravity. That's what Newton said. Okay, Newton said. What Einstein said is, gravity is actually a time-space warp gravitational well. It's a well in time and space that causes the phenomenon of gravity. Gravity is actually an artifact of time-space. So causation, correlation, the cause is actually space-time warp. But what Newton did is correlation. He thought an apple's falling just like the moon falls to the Earth. They're correlated. It took, a couple hundred years. How many years? I think it's 400 years, if I'm not mistaken, for us to figure out, there's something causing this behind the scenes. So it may not be easy. It can take a long time to figure out what the cause is. Okay, sorry, next question there, Jonathan.
Sure thing. So this question: sometimes taking a break And approaching the problem again helped me to approach things in a new way. Could you share some tips on how to orient ourselves to have lateral thinking?
Oh, lateral thinking. Well, we had that little checkbox. If we can go back a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, to the slide number, I believe it's 7, tip number 7, Jonathan. Sorry. Tips on lateral thinking. These are 3 things you could use as techniques. One of the things I find is the person who made the comment about reading outside of your normal area of expertise. Lateral thinking comes from associating something totally different from your field. For example, sometimes people look at animals, the animal kingdom. Let's look at, for example, a good example might be, how do bumblebees fly? Like, how is it that a bee can stay in the air? Like, look at their wings and how they beat. What can we learn from that? That actually was the inspiration for helicopters, believe it or not. The air flow over a bee's wing compared to, helicopter wing. Totally, that lateral thinking is looking at the animal kingdom potentially for interesting analogs where that problem might have already been solved, and we can take it and adapt it to an engineering problem. So let's look at another problem. If you look at shark skin, the skin of a shark, it is extremely non-sticky. I mean, you don't see a lot of barnacles on sharks. You do see them on whales, but you don't see them on sharks. Why is it that sharks don't have barnacles? Nothing seems to attach to them. Well, if you look down on a microscope, they have these very, very tiny little sort of like edges, like plates, sharp little plates, micro plates. And that idea of using micro plates has been used in aquatic sports, in the military with regards to the Navy, and a lot of really interesting engineering applications. So it's lateral thinking. They looked in the animal kingdom, they found an animal that nothing sticks to it. They go, you know what, we could use that same idea over here, right, for equipment going underwater. So what I would encourage you to do is read broadly, experience things broadly, because it's a creative process. And Gayatri, Devi, you're asking that question. Just encourage you to take a break, step out. Sometimes it's literally physically taking a break. Go on a hike, go on a walk, listen to classical music, listen to music that's totally different. Just really step back and give yourself permission to give yourself some space and time. Okay, hopefully those give you some tips.
Great, thank you, Sridhar.
Sure.
So folks, we have about 5 minutes for questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can.
Okay.
Sridhar, here's our next question. Jeff asks, what is a personal work example of critical thinking for you?
Oh, I actually gave one in the talk itself. So as you know, I run, myself, my fellow founder, we run a high technology marketing agency in San Francisco. Our clients a lot of them are software companies, big software companies like SAP, Adobe, Zendesk. And a lot of times a marketing executive really wants to believe that their marketing spending is moving the needle on revenue. And remember my example earlier, it's not always the case. It's not always the marketing spend that's causing revenue to increase. There are other factors going on. It's not just the lead generation campaign. It's not just advertising. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it could be through salespeople doing some amazing things. It could be the support organization. So what I often have to do in our practice is confirmation bias. Am I believing something because I want to believe it and I already believe it? Or let me look at some data that's actually contrary to what we think is going on here. So to me, it's humility. I have, in my work-related example, Jeff, it's being willing to be wrong. I have to be willing to be wrong. And sometimes I am wrong, for sure. What leads me to look at this is the data itself. And also confirmation bias, like, do I just want to believe this and I'm not doing the diligence to examine what's really going on here? In the field of marketing, there's a lot of quantitative data nowadays, tons of analytics. Whenever you go to a website, you're being watched, so to speak, your behavior on the website. They know what you're clicking on, where you're spending time. We as marketing professionals have more data than we've ever had in our life before on consumer behavior, on customer behavior. That data is very helpful. And the thing, work-related example is to look at that and have some critical thinking. You know what? Maybe there are factors that has nothing to do with marketing efforts that are driving success here. Maybe the product is just a killer product. Maybe the support organization is fantastic. Maybe the competition is stumbling and you just lucked out because you're less crappy than they are, so to speak, right? And that's going counter to our ego that tells us, oh, it's because of our killer marketing experience and we look great, we're going to get promoted, I'm going to get my bonus. All of that is true, but be careful, have a little bit of humility, because there may be other things going on that are contributing to success, and it's important to call that out. And I do this all the time with our clients and with my folks in the company.
All right, fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
Here's another question. Are there any criteria to determining if we are in the right direction? A little vague, but
well, there's an old expression in engineering, which is, all that matters is, does it work? Is it effective? At the end of the day, does it work? Does your idea work? Right or wrong? It doesn't matter what your opinion is. Does this? So one criterion I would apply is, if you do a mock-up or prototype, and one of the things you've heard of is agile software development. The whole point of agile is to try stuff. The contrary to agile is so-called waterfall, which is, in the old days, we used to take like a year or two to build software that is this big enterprise, millions of lines of code, and then you release it into the market, and then you find out, what, people don't want what we made, and darn. A better approach is agile, and a criteria I would apply is test in the real market. Get something up there, mock it up, and fail fast. Put it out there. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Move on. Why didn't it work? Use the opportunity to learn. Learn with this. So the criterion here is, try something fast, fail fast if it doesn't work. Learn from that failure. Thomas Edison, you know how many attempts it took before he got the incandescent light bulb to work? He did not invent the light bulb. Common misconception. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb. What he did invent was the filament that could last for hours and hours and hours. Most filaments just burned out quickly. So the criterion he uses, I'm just going to try a zillion materials. It took him 1,000 materials that he went through to finally get the filament in an incandescent light bulb that would burn a long time. So what he did is failed fast. He quickly went through and he just prototyped a bunch of different filament materials. So criteria to determine you're in the right direction is, you try something and maybe that filament didn't burn out in 30 seconds, but it lasted 5 minutes. Oh, we're in the right direction. Let me try a filament that's similar to this. I could go an hour instead of 5 minutes. So I would encourage trial and error. In my book series, one of the chapters is on trial and error. That will tell you if you're moving in the right direction.
Fantastic, thank you. And our final question, and one I think that is appropriate to end off on. Matt asks, do you do something to remind yourself to go back to critical thinking if you drift from it?
Well, usually the reminder comes from other people. Like, I have 4 teenage kids. Three of them are in high school, one's in college, and they remind me, like, hey, Dad, you're pretty quick to a call there. You're sure that's right? So sometimes people around you will tell you, will remind you. And sometimes if you see an argument building, that might be a reminder, like, is there some confirmation bias? Am I holding on dearly to some belief that I have? So one way to remind myself to go back to critical thinking is check in with my body. Like, am I getting angry? Am I getting frustrated? Am I getting kind of really animated? Because those are sometimes clues. That's different from passion. Passion means I'm excited about something that also can have some flaws. But one way to remind yourself is notice what you're doing. Am I getting angry at somebody? Because sometimes that's not critical thinking. That's just arguing. Critical thinking comes from this space of calm and reflection and that kind of stuff. So there are some reminders. I have some stickies too, by the way. I use a little sticky to remind myself to say, ask why, think again. So those are just some reminders for yourself. Hey, but we're all humans, we're gonna do things as a shortcut. So please forgive yourself. We're not always gonna be critical thinkers. Sometimes we're just gonna do short circuits in life. That's how we survive as a species. You can't overthink everything. I just believe right now, with politics, with economics, with all the stuff going on in the world, we as a species need to take the time to do more critical thinking. We'll be better off for it. So I hope you got that from today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Fantastic answer. I think no matter how much we practice on something, especially these kinds of skills, there will be times where we kind of drift off or need reminders from time to time. So no, I absolutely agree. Well, anyways, Srithar, thank you so much for joining us today and providing our audience insight into utilizing critical thinking skills to find better solutions to real-world challenges.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Had a great time. Thank you, all of you, for participating. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for listening. And let's get out there and do a little bit of critical thinking, a little bit more of that, just a tiny bit more. It'll make it a better world.
Absolutely. And as Rita said, thank you to our audience for tuning in and for your great questions. I know we had a few that we weren't able to get to. We do
Oh, sorry.
apologize for that. As mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending a short survey to all registrants after this event, and we would love your feedback regarding this webinar. Check back daily on our social media for future live stream updates, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. And thank you, IEEE USA. You're the best.